friend Bruce Mermelstein from Southampton, a formidable collector of Bugs Bunny, who confesses to a great love for Daffy Duck, the maladjusted mallard, to which one can only say yes. And also a shout out to Peter Braungart, now out in California, a sixth generation guy from Sag Harbor, who designed the 2020 United States postal stamps in honor of Bugs Bunny's 80th birthday last year, called The Many Roles of Bugs. And I'll just briefly hold up, I hope everyone can see it. The stamps are wonderful. Some of them have prescient of Peter, some of them showing Bugs in drag, and the last one showing him holding a baseball, which is pretty appropriate for today, which is the start of the baseball season. It was Peter, in fact, with whom I exchanged a number of emails, who encouraged me to go ahead and do a talk, but he didn't have to do that. As soon as I saw the stamps in the postal office, I was in. Of course, this was not the first time the bunny has been honored in stamps. An earlier time was 1996, when stamps were 32 cents. And the whole idea at that time of issuing the stamps was to encourage stamp collecting. Now, however, both Peter and I hope you, have a very different concern, and that is to advance the classic Bugs Bunny as he existed in the golden years of Warner Brothers, the 40s and the 50s. And as if to celebrate this older, more adult issue, I want to note that last year when the stamps came out, the Wall Street Journal and the New Yorker both ran major pieces on classic Bugs Bunny. Braungart himself was recently featured in the New York Times. He's now executive producer of a new Looney Tunes Merry Melodies company out in LA, creating new cartoons in the spirit of the old cartoons, and they run on HBO Max. But when I asked him what in the 40s and 50s he most loved about the classic Bugs Bunny, he said three things, and I'll be talking about them later. One, Mel Blanc. Two, the directors. And three, unique, the music. Of course, this is not the first time that Bugs has been celebrated by way of stamps. In 1985, he was given a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And in 2002, TV Guide declared him to be the greatest cartoon character of all time. However, what many people remember or think they remember is what they may have seen on TV, but that wasn't the golden years stuff, unless you know where to go now on the internet. What was on TV and what most kids grew up with had true, less aimless violence, but they also had less of what really made Bugs Bunny classic: the wit, the sharpness, the satire, the parody, the caricature. And so the stuff on TV, which of course is still there, is definitely watered down. And the reason was that the Bugs Bunny that we, appreciative of the classics, grew up with, those Bugs Bunnies were in the movies. The stuff on TV became associated with commercials. Bugs was there talking about Raid, Kool-Aid, cereal. He made guest appearances. He was a public service announcer. He made cameo appearances in other movies. My focus is on the Bugs Bunny of the 40s and 50s, the Warner Brothers Bugs Bunny, the great years, the classics. And my theme is twofold. One, those Glory Day cartoons were made for adults, and they were made for literate adults, and they were made by literate artists who knew music, art, literature, who revered comic traditions. They're clever, witty, intelligent, and their music particularly reflects the smarts of all those golden age animators and the culture of their day. My second theme, and this is what I would also like to have as a Q&A participation with you, is my sense that those Glory Day cartoons have something to say to us today, something about heroic character and something about comedy. People loved those old Bugs Bunnies because they loved Bugs Bunny. We have loads of comics and comedians today whom we admire, whom we quote, whom we, send emails to each other to watch. But do we really love them? Do we have the affection that I think the animators of the classics did? As Chuck Jones, one of the great animators, said, you have to love what you caricature. And I kind of put Mel Brooks in that tradition as well. But first, a couple of words about a couple of words. First, the word cartoon. It comes from a Latin word meaning card, and it originally referenced the heavy paper used for sketches of artwork. And then it came to be standing for the caricatures or ridicule, usually political ridicule, of the artists themselves. In other words, cartoons have a long history of being made not for kids, but for adults. Mad Magazine originally started out that way as well. As for the name Bugs, Bugs Stop Bugging Me. It's associated with craziness, as in Bugsy Siegel, whom I've just learned one should never have called Bugsy. His name was Ben. But it was also said that the word bugs may have been taken to fool around a little bit with a guy who was very much part of the studio at the time, a Sergeant Major Ben Hardaway, who turned out to be an old buddy of Harry Truman, who called him Bugs. And as for What's Up, Doc, that comes, of course, from one of the top animators, Tex Avery from Texas. And he noted that it was very common in Texas at the time to call people Doc, much the way we call people pal, dude, or bud. The irony is that What's Up, Doc comes out of Bugs Bunny's mouth when he's faced with danger. Typical Elmer Fudd pointing a gun in his face, Bugs coolly leaning up against a fence, very calm, what's up, Doc? And the irony of facing danger that way became so popular that Avery said he decided to put it in every single Bugs Bunny that he did. And so it became a catchphrase. And now my theme, really, that I would like to have you join in with me at the end to discuss and expand upon. My theme is that Bugs Bunny, the ones that we love, were never made for kids, but for adults. And I have 7 points in no particular order. First, the writers, the animators, the directors themselves said that those Bugs Bunny classics were made for adults. And I'm talking about names that are familiar, I'm sure, to most of you: Chuck Jones, Tex Avery, Fritz Freleng, Frank Tashlin, Bob Clampett, Robert McKimson, and I'm sure there are people out there saying, what about, so many more, but those are the ones that I remember most. Jones himself said explicitly, my films are not made for children. They were made for me. He wrote that in a memoir, The Life and Times of an Animated Cartoonist, 1989. Steven Spielberg wrote the foreword to that memoir, in which he says, "Disney taught me how to fly in my dreams, but Chuck Jones made me laugh at them." And Spielberg acknowledges, though he loved Disney and he is very celebratory of Disney's innovations, he said nonetheless that the Warner Brothers cartoons moved clearly away from the Disney model. The Disney model, sweet preschool characters, and later on a kind of corporate feel, cute, bland, sentimental. Jones said, "Bugs is the glorious personification of our most dapper dreams." And he likened him to Fred Astaire. Cool, smooth, self-aware, and also camp. 2. The Bugs Bunny cartoons, the great classics, use big words and sometimes catchphrases that would not have been understood by kids at all. Elmer calls Bugs not only a wascally wabbit, but my favorite, a tortuous miscreant. Treacherous miscreant to you. I mean, that's a fabulous phrase. And then that was from Stage Door Cartoon from those taking notes in 1944. But there were also other references that would have gone completely by any kids. One of my favorites from A Nightly Night Bugs, 1958. The round table nights include sirloin of beef, cirrhosis of the liver. There were cliches and platitudes that only savvy adults would have loved. The ships were bottled up in the harbor, and indeed they were. The long arm of the law, and you saw it. And one of my favorites today, how prescient. Bugs Bunny is trying to get the attention of the United States Senate. And there's a map of the United States. He's got a saw and he's cutting Florida loose to get the attention of the Senate. But there were also situations that were cliched. And as again, Chuck Jones and his associates said, they wanted to satirize chase scenes, which were all the rage of the day, to show up the shallowness of the whole concept. And I confess that in my freshman English classes, when I taught some years ago, I would bring in examples of all the cliches and the stereotypical expressions. One, to get the students to notice them. Two, of course, to urge them not to use them. Or three, to use them, but extend the metaphors imaginatively, which is what the classic cartoons also did. But in addition to the words and the situations that were satirical, there were allusions and references that no kids would have gotten. References, and I'm talking about now the titles, in fact, of the cartoons. A Sheep in the Deep, What's Opera Doc, which many consider the best, and in which Bugs plays Brunhilde. Elmer is Siegfried, and there's a lot of Wagner there. And it's been pointed out by something that I read that the ballet moves in What's Opera Doc were based on real moves that whoever did it studied the choreography of regular ballets. And of course, the last line of What's Opera Doc really defies the wink-wink association adults have with these cartoons, breaking the fourth wall. At the end, sad to say, Brunhilde dies. And Elmer comes on and says, "What did you expect? A happy ending? This is opera." He's suddenly turning to the audience, and that kind of ironic connection of us as viewers with the Bugs Bunny cartoons is probably the most adult feature of all. 3, the critics, the writers about books on animation said that they were made for adults. Just last year, 2020, Reed Mittenbuehler, the book was reviewed in the Times, came out with Wild Minds, the artists and rivalries that inspired the golden age of animation. And he reminds readers that what they saw and maybe still see on TV, much of it still for kids, was not the stuff that we all saw and loved in the movies. Those golden years cartoons, he says, had spice and sex appeal and wit. They were vital, they were satiric, they were experimental, not child-bound. And again, he references the line that I had from What's Opera Doc, that breaking of the fourth wall, the knowing insider glances and references. Wink, wink, we're in on the joke. 4, the animators and the directors themselves were highly literate. In his memoir, Chuck Jones talks about his absolute love of James Joyce's Ulysses. Anton Bruckner, Grant Wood, quotes them all. He fell in love with Mark Twain, Groucho Marx, Robert Browning, John Keats, Charlie Chaplin. It's an amazing assortment of reading to which he testifies. In developing his Bugs Bunny cartoons, he said, Chuck Jones, he wanted to show a character, quote, with the spicy, somewhat erudite introspection of a Professor Higgins, who, when nettled or threatened, would respond with the swagger of D'Artagnan, as played by Errol Flynn, and with the articulate quick-wittedness of Dorothy Parker. My Bugs, he said, tended to think out his problems and solve them intellectually. And then he added something that Peter Braungart out in California wrote to me about too. He said, Bugs is what I would like to be, debonair, quick-witted, very fast on the comeback. And Braungart, who wrote me, said, I would have loved to say what Bugs said. And not just always Bugs. Every once in a while, the other characters get into it with knowing adult references. And I'm thinking about a particular Frisk Freleng Yosemite Sam, where Yosemite Sam says, the only 2 things a pirate runs for is money and public office. Incidentally, Sam was the one cartoon figure that underwent the least evolution. I mean, he's just vicious, violent, but adorable. Point 5, again, that these were not for kids, but for adults. Those glory years of Bugs Bunny were the war years. And that's when Bugs was most popular. He was serving the war effort. His was a distinct kind of heroism, and he became the nation's wartime mascot. He was on bombers. He was a symbol of America's resistance to Hitler. Some of you may remember Hair meets H-E-R-R meets Hair. He's always persistent in the face of adversity and danger. He doesn't start stuff, but he sure knows how to finish it. A side note, because I mentioned the war years, and I'm going to reference a recent problem that was in the news about Dr. Seuss and references and names that were considered politically incorrect. So the question is, were there politically incorrect references, content in those golden years cartoons? And the answer is yes, and probably more than I see or would want to acknowledge. This was a very different time and a different culture. Nothing, by the way, that I know of race, though ethnicity was certainly, and I won't discuss that now, but it was certainly there in some of the cartoons that are no longer shown. But this was a different time, as I say, and some of you may even recall that Agatha Christie, one of her most famous books, 10 Little Indians, which became a marvelous movie, and then there were none, originally, and this was 1939, originally the title was not 10 Little Indians. Was there violence? Sure, it was the war years. And Braungart, in his contemporary revisiting of the classic features, does say that he and his associates don't do guns. But he also hired, he told me, someone who used to work in a comic environment where there was a lot of physical violence. And he hired this guy because he's wonderfully talented. And this man spoke of his love of the classic Bugs Bunny. And he said those Bugs Bunny cartoons reminded him, the bugs in there, of Humphrey Bogart. He developed his own Bugs Bunny update called Dynamite Dance, which I saw, where Bugs is continually dropping TNT explosives on Elmer. And yes, it's violent. But he winds up Bugs by doing something that is just delicious. After he drops, a ton of this stuff on his head, goes over to him and gives him a big fat smooch on the lips. And anyway, the guns that were in the classics never seemed to hurt anybody. Everyone was immortal. Point 6. The people who participated in the making of the cartoons took their work seriously, and I'm thinking particularly of Mel Blanc, the man of 1,000 voices. He spoke of Bugs as smart and smartass, and he went through Brooklyn and the Bronx kind of amalgamating whatever dialects he could and putting them together. Of course, he didn't just do Bugs, he did Porky Pig. And he is famous for having said at one point, "You want me to do the voice of a pig? That's some job for a nice Jewish boy." But he went to a pig farm, and he's written about this, and studied pigs and behavior. I mean, the devotion, the dedication that everyone had in these cartoons, I think is memorable. Incidentally, I read somewhere that Mel Blanc was allergic to carrots. Point 5, perhaps the most crucial of all in distinguishing feature of the old classics that were made for adults, was the music. Carl Stalling was a genius. The soundtracks are fabulous, and they reference and allude to so many classical composers. The famous ones you can think of: Rossini, Beethoven, Liszt, Wagner. But behind it all was Warner Brothers. They put up a 50-piece orchestra. That's a rather incredible investment to make in cartoons. Some of those cartoons you know by names. You probably can recite whole scenarios. Rhapsody Rabbit, where the Hungarian Rhapsody is played by Bugs the pianist. But in other cartoons, and I think it was Long-Haired Hare, Bugs is Leopold Stokowski. And Leopold Stokowski at one point was famous for being annoyed at someone coughing in the audience and breaking his baton. And this cartoon alludes to that. These guys knew it. They knew the whole classical repertoire. Chuck Jones and Mike Maltese, I associate with many of the music cartoons, but they were celebrated and satirizing at the same time. It was love and lampoon. And now, what does all this mean for us today? And I mean us, we who are here loving and celebrating Bugs Bunny on his 80th year and on. I think, first of all, as a character, he exemplifies someone who's fair, who upturns the rules of the game, but he is never cruel. He's never exclusionary. He's not tribal. He's optimistic. Freeling did say that Elmer was about as stupid and forgivingly sweet as you could get. And as the war years went on, the gang at the Termite Terrace, as they were called, started to create more threatening adversaries for Bugs. And he certainly got a more fired up enemy with Yosemite Sam, who comes blazing in with guns all the time, but never seems to hurt anyone. And then monsters. And I'm sure there are people there now who can say with me one of the most famous lines from a cartoon, "Water, water, every hair." And that alludes, of course, to Samuel Taylor Coleridge, Rime of the Ancient Mariner. But in your best Vincent Price voice, do never send a monster to do the work of an evil scientist. No kid's going to understand all of that. We live in a very different world. We live in an age of tribal differences. And as I said, Bugs is universal. What's also significant is that he's not an underdog. That was a reflection of the first generation of immigrants, when comedy often turned on victimization. Bugs is for the generation after that. Wheedling, scheming, a trickster, but never mean and never cruel. As Chuck Jones says, he shows us our own mistakes, mishaps, and stumbling, and perhaps subliminally reassures us by demonstrating through laughter that we are not alone. He exemplifies the rueful recognition of our own ineptitudes. As I started reading about and watching again so many of the cartoons, I got involved in another appreciation of Bugs Bunny that I wanted to share with you, because I think it's part of what I wanted to say, why I think he's so meaningful to us today. When you see those cartoons, you sense a joy in their creation. And I think there's something, and I say this with great affectionate nostalgia, something wonderful about the kind of workplace that the animators came from. We work solo, and I just don't mean that because of the pandemic. Several years ago, I visited the Bloomberg offices when they first started, and they were very famous for having the cubby holes. They may have had general food courts all around, but people began to work in isolation by themselves. And what the Termite Terrace gang at Warner Brothers did was work together as a unit. And you sense in their work, and particularly when you read the memoirs, a great love of working together. And I wanted to celebrate that with you today because I think the cartoons reflect that. There's no one author, no one animator associated with Bugs. It was the studio, and they were a community. You really got the sense that they loved working, and they loved working together. They loved working together so much that they could satirize their boss, Leon Schlesinger, without his really knowing it. And that figures in also a number of cartoons. I don't know whether he recognized what they were doing. But they got together and they had this great appreciation of each other, not only as co-workers, but as competitors. And I thought of that when I recently read a book that I totally recommend, The Code Breaker by Walter Isaacson. It's just come out. and it's about Jennifer Doudna, who was one of the creators of the code that broke the COVID virus finally, but she did the gene splicing research that, with Emmanuel Charpentier, won her the Nobel Prize in 2020. And in his book, Walter Isaacson speaks about the intellectual as well as emotional charge that Doudna told him about, of working not only with people in her lab, her associates, her workers, but with her competitors. And she also spoke about the joy, even though they were doing email, particularly in the last years, the joy of meeting in person. And Walter Isaacson, whose theme is celebrating what science and technology can innovate, makes the point that that is the one important factor that all of the scientists speak about, getting together with not only their fellow workers, but their fellow competitors. And that is exactly what Jennifer Doudna did in finally working against COVID. So I wanted to mention that as a wonderful celebration, not just of what these guys at the termite terrace did, but that they did it and how they did it. And again, with another nod to Walter Isaacson and the code breakers, what he also celebrates about the top scientists is their love of being multi-talented. They love music, they love art, they love science. And this is what you get from the Bugs Bunny classics. Those animators, those directors with the references, the allusions, were a multi-talented artistic gang. And I wanted somehow to get that out because I think that's an extremely important direction, or reclaiming if possible, because we've become so over-specialized. The idea that the references in the cartoons could be as wide as they were is probably impossible for most people today. And we've come a long way from, what was it, the late 90s, no, I'm sorry, the late 50s, when C.P. Snow, some of you may know his book, The Two Cultures, when he spoke about the widening separation between the humanities and the sciences. And he took on F.R. Leavis, a very famous literary critic, and he said in effect to Leavis, I can recite any number of plots of Shakespeare, but you can't tell me the second law of thermodynamics. And since then, as Isaacson points out in The Codebreaker, not only has this disparity between the humanities and the sciences and technologies widened, but even among the humanities, there are people who simply cannot move from art to music to literature, even within these silos, from literature of one genre to another. And so I think what the Bugs Bunny, this is really, I know, a stretch, I confess, but what I sensed in the Bugs Bunny and what I wanted to talk about, and hope you will in watching these again, was the intelligence, the wide culture of the people who created these fabulous cartoons, and their joy in doing so, their joy in working together. Not only that, but they are and still and were and still are educative. Many of us as young adults learned about history, classical music from these, particularly What's Opera Doc. Maybe we didn't know that that was the ring cycle that What's Opera Doc was centered on. Maybe we didn't know that they were getting off on Disney's take in Fantasia of A Night on Bald Mountain by Mussorgsky, but they were mocking that as well. They were mocking the way the classical music was presented in the films of the day. So they learned their craft, and they learned it because they were interested in many different subjects and many different disciplines. And so finally, what I wanted to celebrate about these cartoons was not only the wide intelligence and culture and love that they evince. But I think there's something wonderful about them as comedy. And that's what I think they have to say to us today. And I was thinking about comedy in the old classical sense of Dante, the Inferno, the Purgatory, and the Divine Comedy at the end. Tragedy is, as someone said, when you reach a point of no return and there's nowhere else to go. Comedy at the end takes you out and reestablishes you with society and with the world. It's restorative. When it is good, like the Bugs Bunny cartoons, it fills you with some affection. And even though Dante's comedy moves us out to spiritual regeneration, the Bugs Bunny classics, and again, this may be a stretch, does restore us to a sense of humanity and sanity. It's a form of salvation. And I think that particularly now, it is Wabbit season. It's also Maundy Thursday, Holy Thursday. And Maundy is a wonderful word. It comes from a Latin word which means command, as Jesus commanded love. And I think the classics do generate just that. They're classic in another sense as comedy. They're full of absurdity, of contradiction, of the discrepancy between what is and what should be, but they also have a sense of love. And that is really, that's all, folks. Thank you. I'd be very happy to hear your comments about my
Thank you very
beloved
much. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat or use the raise hand feature if you'd like. I'm going to look through the chat and see we have question is asked, are there any other characters on the Hollywood Walk of Fame? And we have a response to that. We have Alvin and the Chipmunks, Donald Duck, Mickey Mouse, Minnie Mouse, Rugrats, Shrek, The Simpsons, Snoopy, and more, all on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Do you think they were, that this is referring to the cartoons in general, do you not think there were lessons for children in the cartoons? Think of the faked death scene where an angry Elmer Fudd shoots Bugs Bunny and feels terrible regret.
It's a very difficult question to answer because I'm trying to imagine from the consciousness of a child of how that kind of act is processed, and I don't know.
We have, let's see, are you excited for Fantasia 2030?
I don't know about Fantasia 2030. Tell me, tell us. Dear Brownguard, who's out in LA, redoing in the spirit of the classics, the Bugs Bunnies, has said to me regarding my remark of the joy of working with other people on a common great subject, that he gets a big thrill out of working. It's not the termite terrorist gang, but he gets a big thrill out of working with his associates. And they're all trying to beat the clock and do in 6 months what it took decades to do at Warner Brothers. And so he, in effect, is saying that he appreciated that joyous work atmosphere and is very happy that he can recreate that and not just Bugs.
Excellent, excellent.
Do we have the Fantasia 2030? I'm gonna go crazy to find out about it.
We have, let's see. Unfortunately, Her Majesty the Queen could not do the usual Monday, Thursday coin giveaway this year. That's in there. And that was just Ducky, not Daffy at all. Have you seen the short film clip that shows the Warner's animators physically acting out scenes before animating them?
No, I haven't. No, I haven't. You know, the tendency here was to just start listing a whole bunch of cartoons by name, hoping that, you know, the fans would know, but then that's just a listing. And then we'd have to get into all of that. But I hope the references, the few, were sufficient to get you to look again and pick up all those marvelous cliches and the witty allusions. There's so many. They're wonderful.
We have a lot of wonderful comments. Thank you. That was wonderful. Just
What
terrific.
is this carrot?
Lots of insights and shrewd observations and love. It was very interesting, brought back more memories. Enjoyable presentation. A lot of, they loved the earrings. And Jacob doesn't have a microphone on the computer, but he says the only thing we know about Fantasia 2030 is the name and date. And Andre says, excellent. What you said gave me a broader perspective on old school cartoons and giving them much more respect and admiration. And let's see, does anybody have any other questions? The mics
Wait a
are
minute,
open.
someone I think found something on 2030. Well, we'll all go away and get Googled and find out what we can.
This link is to the information about the upcoming film.
Ah,
Dave asks, what's the best way to find the Bugs cartoons from the 40s?
get on to Google and do the Warner Brothers 40s and 50s. Just put in those key terms. Also, I'm sure that there are special collections that are out now and for sale, right?
If you go to Warner Brothers Archives,
Right.
they have very nice sets that they put together of classic Warner Brothers and MGM materials, because they own all the pre-86 MGM material. So there's excellent sets on that Warner Archive manufacturer on demand site. Bugs won an Oscar in '58 because Disney usually captured the award. Nighty Night Bugs was it, and that's Knights spelled like Knights of the Round Table.
Well, that's the one with sirloin of beef and cirrhosis of the liver.
And let's see, Lynn says YouTube has some clips. Question, do you like Lola Bunny or Honey Bunny?
Like Lola. I mean, the campiness and the transgender stuff, I mean, it was so prescient. And that these would go on stamps too was just wonderful. So I think it's very au courant.
Let's see, Donald says, especially glad to know these cartoons are for adults, that it isn't childish to enjoy them. No, certainly not.
Right.
Do you like Bugs Bunny in Who Framed Roger Rabbit or Space Jam?
I'm going to not go the sci-fi route. But again, I go back, the ones that I cite, the ones that are in my heart are the ones I already referenced and alluded to from the 40s and 50s. As the 50, well, What's Opera Doc was 1958 or 59. Certainly they were still coming out with original stuff in the 60s, but by then they're starting to appear on TV and they're taking a different form and certainly getting a different audience. So
let's see, we have Kathy says, husband and I always note that viewers were expected to be well-read and culturally aware. Do you think they expected even high school grads to be able to get the references?
that's hard to say unless we go down another cliched road that, oh, high school then was college today, but that's another story. People were better read in the schools. But certainly not, I would think, not with the music. I think the music education that we had was force-fed, but stayed with us, but was not of any on our own recognition. And perhaps that's true of some of the literary references too. Look, the famous line of never send a monster to do a work of an evil scientist comes from a cartoon where the title itself is a famous quatrain out of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Who knew? Probably not.
Let's see. Nighty Night is the name of a killer animatronic in 2020's movie Willy's Wonderland, starring some guy named Nicolas Cage. That look at that.
Right. Who can be pretty camp at times and ironic.
South Park has a documentary that shows a group working together to produce cartoons in more recent times. I think that was called 6 Days to Air.
Oh, okay.
I think it's streaming on their Comedy Central channel.
Okay.
Let's see. HBO Max has a Looney Tunes collection. So
that's it. That's the big one.
If you have the HBO Max app on your television, by all means, you can look at some classic Bugs Bunny.
I hope when this is over that you can find a lot of this on Google, that you just sit there and watch a whole bunch of them, the originals. They're just delicious.
If you have some old, very, very, very early on in the VHS era, Warner Brothers put out VHS tapes that they called them A Night at the Movies. So, and I
how did you spell that?
It was night, regular night, N-I-G-H.
Right.
But I could recall as a child, if somebody wanted to see, say, Ocean's 11 with Frank Sinatra, there would be a Warner Brothers cartoon at the beginning and a newsreel, and then it would go into the film.
Mm-hmm.
And this series, A Night at the Movies, Warner's put out probably about 30 different titles of their most popular films. And this was like 1980, 81. So, you know, if you find one of these old VHSs, like a copy of PT 109, or you find a copy of Sunrise at Campobello, you know, and it says A Night at the Movies, and it's in one of those large clamshell boxes, it may indeed have an award-winning Warner Brothers cartoon at the beginning of it, because that was part of that series.
Right.
I could recall my parents telling me, you know, when they went to the movies, it was an event. You go to the movies and you saw not one film, but you saw cartoons, a newsreel, coming attractions, maybe a smaller picture for the first feature, sometimes referred to as the B picture, but you know, a lot of times, sometimes she told me the B picture was better than the main feature. But that was all the cartoons came with part of the movie going experience at that time.
Indeed. And the newsreels were particularly important. And again, seen against the Bugs Bunny movies that came out when he was the mascot of the war, meant something different. Again, no kiddies. They may have been allowed, but no kiddies really taking the full sense of what the kind of heroic posture of Bugs meant at that time.
The mid to late 40s and into the early 50s, one would regularly go on a Saturday morning to the Deluxe on Tremont Avenue, where starting at 9:30 in the morning, it was cartoons. It was continuous cartoons. The price of admission was probably 15 or 20 cents. Continuous cartoons, absolute bedlam, absolute pandemonium. things got much more mature at about noon when they'd have a Frank Buck movie or so. But during the Bedlam, I remember that Bedlam, when Bugs came on, Bedlam turned into pandemonium. So at some Ur level, we understood that Bugs was a superior being. No question.
Right. Well, I'm glad you said pandemonium with its devilish connotation,
Exactly.
and Tasmanian devil being one of the later enemies of Bugs.
We have, do you think Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck are among one of the best rivalries in animation?
Yes, and because I'm going to kind of allude again to Walter Isaacson, not only because they are just on their own so important and significant, but because they were rivals and they kept on meeting again. So they became companion rivals, and we anticipated their meeting and their fighting and the way it was resolved. Absolutely.
Jacob asks, will you be doing any more talks about cartoon characters?
No, but I will be talking about a book later on in the spring that has been made into a cartoon, and that's Gulliver's Travels.
Which is a fantastic book by Swift and made many times as a film.
And which many people, like the kiddies as opposed to the adults, many people think consists only of books 1 and 2, and not the misanthropic, witty, sharp, satiric, depressing, misanthropic 4th book. So maybe the theme is the same, to kind of restore what we see and what we read to the rightful audience in the rightful way.
Well, let's see, we have one more. I know this defies the laws of gravity, but you see, I never studied law. Bugs Bunny quote. Jacob put in the chat there.
We're going to have a whole famous collections of famous sayings. I'm surprised that no one's come out with a book on that. Thank you.
And Dory says, this was great, brought back many memories. Thank you. And
I'll say one thing. When I bought the stamps, the first book, I so fell in love with them. Here they are again. That I didn't send letters to anybody. I finally, just to use them, sent them to myself, just to keep them.
nice collector's piece.
Oh, they're wonderful. They're wonderful. Well, thank you all. As I said, that's all. But it's a great deal to honor and celebrate. And I thank you all for tuning in. It was a great pleasure for me. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll see you again at the next talk. All the best,
Okay,
everyone,
great.
and best, Joan. And,
Oh, look at that.
Thanks again.
Oh, there's a pussycat there. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.